Добрий день.
Добрий день всім.
Добрий день.
Hello, everyone. Hello, hello.
Учасники, дуже дякую,
So,
що
dear
долучилися до
participants,
цього
thank you
вебінару.
so much
Я
that you took your
сподіваюся,
time to
що
join
для
this
вас буде
webinar.
корисним.
I do
Надалі
hope that
нові
it will be
знання
very
ви зможете
helpful
впроваджувати
and that
у
you will
своїй
be able to
роботі.
implement the new knowledge into your
Наголошую,
work.
що у нас є
Let me
опція синхронного
highlight that
перекладу.
we have the function of
Зараз
simultaneous
окремо надішлемо
interpretation.
інструкцію в
Right
чат.
now, we will separately
Але
put the
якщо
instruction
бачите
in the
знизу,
chat.
ви обираєте український канал чи
So
англійський.
please click on English or Ukrainian channel.
Також після того, як
Also,
відбудеться вебінар, вам будуть надіслані
after
деякі
the
матеріали
webinar,
на пошту,
you
які ми
will
вказували
get
при реєстрації,
the
і
materials
записи,
that
але щодо цього
you
питання я
will
вас ще
hear
зорієнтую
today
ближче
and the
до
recording,
кінця вебінару.
but closer
Дякую.
to the end, I will let you know more about it. Thank you.
Так, презентації також бачу в чаті.
I can see the presentations in the chat as well, the presentation on how to activate the simultaneous
Щодо
interpretation.
сертифікатів одразу скажу,
And
так як
about the
це вебінар,
certificates,
а не
since
навчання
this is the
в плані,
webinar, not a
такого
training,
повноцінного, без
not the
супервізії, то за
full
даний захід
training with
сертифікати не
supervisions,
передбачені.
so there will be no certificates for attending this webinar.
Тому я думаю, що ми можемо
That's why I
починати.
think we can start.
Слово або Мосесу, тренеру, або
Moses
Меган з центру
or
ARQ
Megan
International.
from ARQ International, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sergey. My name is Megan Bahmed, and I'm a senior advisor for mental health and psychosocial support at ARQ International. And we're very pleased to be hosting this webinar for you today, along with the WHO and the technical working group in Ukraine on suicide prevention in Ukraine. And for this very important topic, we are thrilled to be bringing you our esteemed colleague, Moses Mukasa. I'll just do a quick introduction of Moses. Moses is currently the Interregional Advisor for Mental Health and Psychosocial Support for East and Southern Africa at the Jesuit Refugee Services. He has worked on MHPSS and the specific issue of suicide prevention in countries such as Switzerland, Denmark, Italy, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Mali, and Malawi, among others. He is the author of the UNHCR publication, Planning for Prevention and Risk Mitigation of Suicide in Refugee Settings, a toolkit for multi-sectoral action. And he's a double PhD candidate in educational sciences and psychology at the University of Ghent in Belgium and clinical psychology at Makawe University in Uganda. Moses, we're thrilled to have you here. Please go ahead and take the floor.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, colleagues, for hosting me.
Moses, we cannot hear you. Maybe there is a problem with the connection.
Вирвешся волосся. Вирвешся волосся. Та я не пам'ятаю.
If you help me move the next slide, Sahid, that would be very helpful.
Moses, we didn't hear anything you were saying because the connection got interrupted from the very beginning.
Yeah, my apologies. So thank you so much, Megan, for the introductions, and thanks for hosting me today. I'm super excited to be sharing with you this rarely given attention subject in the field of mental health and public health. I'm so glad that I'm here and everyone is here today to listen in, but also give reflections and feedback. I'm here to give you information, but also to learn from you. Just a few caveats. Suicide, as you know, it's a widespread phenomenon that is very complex. I'll try my level best to address most of the questions in the course of my presentation, but also to say, in case some of the subjects, the aspects of this presentation touch your life experience or trigger memories and thoughts, I may not be able to provide treatment throughout this webinar. But what I can suggest is we have teams on this same call who have expertise in country, in Ukraine, but also are specialized in supporting individuals going through difficult times. So that's the caveat I want to really put across. So if you can help me move to my first slide. Again, please keep going. Thank you. So you need to keep scrolling. So as we know, as I mentioned, suicide is a very complex issue with diverse interpretation across different cultures, moral frameworks, and academic disciplines. We don't have a one-way traffic explanation of causes and drivers of suicide, but we have multiplicity of factors that manifest and are explained throughout the different cultural settings, cultural constructs, moral frameworks, academic disciplines, as well as the legal disciplines of the world. And in fact, it's for me very important to share with you that whereas there's so much documentation that has been done around suicides, there's been less documentation and work done around suicides and refugee crisis, as well as conflict-affected populations. And that's why this webinar is very critical and very timely to our ongoing response in the context of Ukraine. Different scholars and different researchers have tried to really help us understand, even within its complex framework, what suicide is. And one of those people that I love talking about so much is Edwin Snedden. He tries to really share his understanding of what suicide is. And in fact, he places much emphasis to the experiences of trauma and pain and psychological pain. And in his view, suicides do not necessarily refer or come along because one is
Sorry, Moses, you're breaking up.
unable, ashamed of themselves because of
Sorry,
grief,
you're
anger,
breaking up.
and
We
that
couldn't
suicide
hear
is
you.
more of a transitional process. And you can't hear me now? Can you
For
hear me?
about 1 minute, we couldn't hear you, something like that.
Okay, sorry. So I was saying that suicide has been defined by multiple researchers, academicians, and one of those outstanding definitions that I found that speak to the context of Ukraine is the one advanced by a sociologist called Edwin. So he really recognizes that psychological pain, especially due to exposure to different unfortunate events, including war, loss, leads to psychological pain that drives people into anger, excessive anger. And actually, that gives them a feeling of entrapment and desire to take their own life. So it's important that we understand that suicide happens in different contexts and by different reasons. If you can move to the next slides, I will speak a little bit about what terminologies we need to speak about in this presentation, but also why they matter. So when we talk about suicide, beyond what scholars have put together, we mean all intentional actions carried out by an individual in our context. Could be a patient who's in your health facility, it could be a community member or a group of people. So suicide is not limited to an individual. It can be a group of people, a community who aim to terminate their own life for their own specific reasons. And suicide is made up of two important concepts. One is what we call suicide ideations. These are sometimes referred to as thoughts. So we have what we call passive suicide thoughts or ideations. We have what we call active suicide thoughts. Now, I don't know how many of us sometimes feel very excited and happy, and we use words like, "Oh, I'm so happy. I wish I can die." So normally in my country where I come from, when young ladies and men are very happy and excited, they passively use words like, "Oh, this is so funny. I can't wait to die." That is a passive thought. It has no intention to take one's life. It's a passive way of speaking about death. So someone says it, but not with the intention of taking their own life. So we need to separate that. But in the context of psychological distress and mental health, passive suicides are a starting point for one starting to feel trapped and being in pain. They may say, "I wish I was dead," as a way of communicating the psychological pain they are going through. Now, those people are at the starting point of desiring to take their own life, but they have no intent of dying. We have what we call active suicidal thoughts. People who use active suicidal thoughts use terms like "I should," maybe I should die. Now, those people are intentional, and really, if given an opportunity, they will take their own lives. We have what we call suicidal attempts. These are defined as non-fatal self-directed potentially injurious behaviors with an intent to take one's life. So when someone attempts suicide, they are not joking. They really want to take their own life. They want to escape the pain that Edwin, we mentioned above, is talking about. If you can move to my next slide, Sahil, I want to talk about the language we use as practitioners. We often use words in suicide prevention and response that sometimes increase. Oh, no, we're not yet there. First go back to the table. There. So we often use words in suicide that we don't know how they impact those who are at imminent risk, or how these impact the communities we work with. I want to share with you, if you can see my screen for sure, we've changed the language. Many years ago, we used to use words like "died by suicide," we used to say "committed suicide," which is a common phrase used literally across the world, especially in contexts where there's less engagement and discussion around the subject. And we used to use words like "failed suicide attempt." We used to use parasuicides, suicidal tendencies, suicidal person, successful suicide. But we've moved away from this, and this has been informed by research and deeper commitment by the ISP, which is the organization responsible for global suicide efforts, at WHO as well, with a lot of work being done. So we no longer use words like committed suicide because it carries a crime or sin or criminalizing tone. So we use words like "died by suicide." So when you're engaging with people, you want to be sure not to criminalize the language you are using. Attempted suicide is the favorite term we are using currently as a replacement for failed suicide. This is because even when we are helping people, we want to be less judgmental. We no longer use words parasuicide. We opt to use words like non-fatal suicidal behaviors. Again, we used to use words like suicidal tendencies, which is so common in many medical practitioners. We no longer use that. We've shifted to suicidal thoughts or ideations. We no longer use suicidal persons. We use words like persons with lived experiences. Successful suicides, we use words suicidal death. Please, you can move to the next slide. Now, we have what we call early warning suicide signs. These are very important for us to understand since we are engaging with different communities and groups of people. Next slide. Next slide, Sahil. Yeah, excellent. So we are working with people, and it's important to understand what are the telltale signs that we can work with? How can we be sure that the people we are working with are supported at the first phase before they really end up in the active phase, what you call the evolution phase? So there are different signs that we can really observe and say, "Oh, this person is likely to be at risk." And some of these include frequently talking about suicide, also frequently talking about death. So sometimes when people speak, we just looked at the ideation phase, looked at the difference between suicide ideation, passive suicidal ideations and active suicidal ideations. So when someone says, oh, I want to take my own life, I want to die, they sometimes, in most cases, mean it. Some people actually make suicidal threats. I will take my life one day. I one day I'll go and I'll never come back. So these are some of the signs we really look at. Excessive use in substances, especially psychoactive substances and alcohol. So people who excessively change abruptly and start, using substances excessively may be wanting to take their own lives, but not all the time. That says when someone takes a lot of alcohol, they are suicidal. So we need to separate between recreational substance use versus harmful substance use. Those are very important pieces to really pay attention to. Overexpression of hopelessness is a clear sign that we want to pay attention to, and then be able to identify and support that person at an earlier stage. Giving away things that you once owned. So in most cases, people who are actively suicidal, they give away everything they have in most cases because they assume that where they are going, that's death, may not require any material possession. Please take note that these signs and symptoms vary from one person to another, from culture to culture, and age and diversity. So we cannot assume that because Moses is actually talking about taking their own life, they will take it. You need to be very clear and understand where the person is coming from and which culture they are living in. So also in terms of age, so children may behave differently from adults. Adults may behave differently from people with specific multiple intersecting vulnerabilities. So WHO actually supports so much with suicide prevention and response, and indeed they cluster suicide warning signs into 3 levels. They have what you call behavioral warning signs. If you can move to my next slide, we have what you call emotional warning signs, and then we have what you call verbal warning signs. Now, let us first look at behavior warning signs, the things that you can observe in a person who walks into your clinic, who is in your community, who is in your family or household, or who you work with and say, oh, by the way, this person's behaviors have changed. Of course, time is very important in suicide prevention because we need to observe, we need to ask, we need to see how has the person's life been in the last 2 weeks and how is it now, last month. Please be aware that suicidal ideations can last for up to 30 years. The person can actually hold suicidal ideations for up to 30 years when they really think and plan to take their own lives. So we shall see that in the next slides. Anyway, behavior-wise, so we look at withdrawal or isolating oneself from friends. So that is a sudden withdrawal. It may not be something that the person has been doing, but a sudden withdrawal. Sudden meaning they stop associating, they stop engaging with things, the groups they used to participate in. That should be a critical worry for you. Extremely getting agitated or engaging in reckless behaviors. We talk about excessive drinking or drinking of alcohol, smoking excessively, that is psychoactive drugs, abusing drugs, over driving, reckless driving of cars, also engaging in other risky behaviors that can be observed. So these are some of the behaviors that happen among patients and individuals who are at imminent risk. We talked about sleeping too little and too much. So some of the behavioral symptoms are similar to those found and common in depressive disorders. We also looked at behavior-wise, giving away prized possessions or saying goodbyes without going anywhere. Oh, for example, normally in my work and my practice, I always hear people saying, oh, I'm going somewhere, I will never come back. And I'm going somewhere, please, you know, my best car, the car I've owned for many years, especially among older persons. Oh, I know I won't be here anymore. So please, in case you never see me again, give my car to so and so. So we need to be careful about those statements. Next slide is about emotional warning signs. These are very, very important. showing extreme mood swings. Of course, as I mentioned, depression and suicide are two inseparable sisters. It's a love story where one dates the other. They've been dating each other and falling in love for the last years since their existence. It's sometimes difficult to separate between the symptoms and signs of suicide from the signs and symptoms of depression, especially where there's an excessive mood swing, which is common in bipolar, among others. So feeling of hopelessness, as I mentioned, these are some of the symptoms that are also found in depression. But again, please note that not all symptoms or emotional expressions are verbatively expressed or can be overtly seen. So we shall see how to ask questions and how to engage and get to know more about this. Feeling trapped or in unbearable pain. So normally when people are dealing with difficult experiences, including psychological pain that is talked about by Edwin, especially among a displaced population, they always feel their lives at the edge. They feel they can't go anywhere. They feel they are trapped and entrapped and really want to escape that pain. The pain is too unbearable that these people really keep complaining of too much pain and want to find a way of living. So those continuous expressions that may not be communicated verbally but expressed in terms of reactions are very important to document and observe. Loss of interest in things they used to enjoy, what we call anhedonia. So sometimes people who are suicidal, if it was, of course, as a health worker, as a practitioner, you may not necessarily ask, but you can ask. So sometimes men lose interest in sexual activities. This is also common in depression. If they used to play pool table, or if they used to engage, or if women used to engage or watch a specific movie, or engage with the specific friends in specific activities. If they are veterans, if they used to have their clubs where they go and meet, they will stop doing those things suddenly. They will stop doing all those things. So that shows you that they are withdrawing. And in terms of verbal warnings, which are interesting in my experience, is many practitioners always think verbal warnings are a complaint and jokes that are made by people who are going through pain, who just want attention. Because I always see a community is telling me, we think people who are suicidal and are talking about it are just complaining and want attention. I can tell you that they don't just want attention. They are screaming for help. They are demanding for help. They want you to see their psychological pain. They want you to see that they are trapped and need someone to speak to help them overcome these painful experiences. So when someone's talking about wanting to die, they're either talking about it at a passive ideation phase or at an active ideation phase. Talking about being a burden to others, this is very common among veterans and people with disabilities, but also people who can't take care of themselves. So normally in war and conflict, this category is very at risk because they feel they can't contribute anymore to their societies. They think they are a burden to the family members without resources. It is very worse if one of these members was the breadwinner or the family head in a household or in the community, or if it was a high-ranking officer. So they feel they are a burden and really have no reason to live anymore. Talking about feeling hopelessness or having no reasons to live, they normally say, why do I have to live? This life has no meaning. We've lost this, we've lost that. So these are verbal warning signs we want to pay attention to. Oh, by the way, so next slide, which I want to share with you, is about, I don't know how much you are aware of what's going on and how heavy and important this topic is. I want to take you through the global trends. I think it's important that we understand why this webinar is of great importance. If you can move to the next slide. And again, and why we need to understand that suicide is, next slide. Next slide. I think you are still, yeah, there. Exactly. So it's important that we understand that suicide is not only it's not a small challenge. It's a big global issue. It's a global public health concern that has been documented widely, and indeed it even has as a goal in the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a big issue. So I don't know if you know and you are aware that close to 700,000 people die every year. Every year. Imagine every year, by the time people are going to eat Christmas holidays, we are documenting 700,000 deaths. And this is only what is documented as an estimate. But there are so many other cases which we don't know that are happening. And in fact, men, just like it is in Ukraine, from the data I read and I went through, men die more than women. And this is because of many different population dynamics that exist across the world. You know that for the time we've been on this webinar, count 40 seconds backward. So it means for every 40 seconds, one person has taken their own lives. They've really decided to leave this world. Just in 2021, the global suicide rate was 9.0 per 100,000 people, which means the numbers of suicides are escalating every day. In fact, when we say 9.0, we mean that for every time you move in one of the cities in Ukraine or in a village in Ukraine where there are more than 100,000 people, there are at least 9 people dying or at imminent risk. So this is a big subject for us. So we know that besides what I've mentioned as statistics, for every statistics that I've shared, there's a story, there's pain, not only for the immediate family members, but also for the communities left behind. In fact, suicides in every context, including in Ukraine, increase by age. So the more people grow, the more they are at risk. What has been documented so far is suicides are extremely common among individuals between the age of 15 and above. So what has been shown is so the more people grow, the more they actually turn out to be at risk. So there are so many different population dynamics. For example, there's war, there's age, there's gender, there's diversity. So all these factors shape which age category gets to be at more risk. And again, every region, every country is unique. Same it is with Ukraine. So in terms of partners, so studies are being conducted that have shown that indeed Europe currently, that is Western Europe, has had a significant increase in suicides, and I will give you the reasons why. And part of the known reasons are the more there's industrialization, growth, and development, the more society gets more individualized. On contrary to Eastern Europe, where Ukraine could be, I'm not so sure, can guide me on that. There's been a lot of cohesion and a strong social fabric for a while. And that has kept the numbers below. But now, over time, the countries are developing in Eastern Europe. Same it is with Africa. And the more we are expressing development, the more we are getting more individualized. But also not to mention that Eastern Europe and Africa, for example, as well as Southern America, we are going through a lot of conflicts, violence. And as I mentioned at the start of my slides, psychological pain is one of the drivers of suicidal behaviors and ideations. Let's come back to Ukraine. Zooming back, if you can move the slides. So in 2019, Ukraine ranked 10 in the world with a suicide rate of 14.7 per 100,000 people. This is a huge story, unfortunately. So these numbers have since been increasing because of many factors. One is because of what we have in Ukraine currently, the side story, the war, the infrastructure being broken down, growing levels of distress, psychological pain. The individuals who actually previously had pre-existing mental health conditions, they are no longer getting the right support they were getting before. So a combination of all these experiences are good explanations to why currently the suicide trends in Ukraine are increasing. Now, I want to share with you what is very interesting. If you can look at my screen, where there's July data and 2021 data, specifically for Ukraine. Before, the war in Ukraine, which is exactly what I talked about, that before suicide rates were already high in the context of Ukraine, but after war, we've seen this. So you can show those two bars. So before the war, just suicide ideations, what I talked about as passive and active thoughts, we are rated to be at 0.55, that's 0.55%, which it was worrying, but not extremely worrying. And this wasn't so different from many of the countries that have already their own population dynamics, economic dynamics, but also political dynamics. After 2022, look at that. We had a swift increase to 1.7%. That's a huge statistic. And that means that there's a lot of work that needs to be done around suicidal behaviors and prevention and response. Thoughts are not enactments. But remember, for every suicide attempt and enactment, it is preceded by a suicidal thought, which means where we have an increase in suicidal thoughts, it predicts future enactments. We shall see that in the next slides. So the fact that right now in Ukraine, we have an increase among people within the affected population, where people have high suicidal thoughts, it means we are at risk of having a surge in enactments, which is taking people moving to attempts. And when people move to attempts, it becomes very hard for us to reverse the trend. So we need to work a little bit harder to prevent the rise or to reduce the burden, the psychological burden, access to mental health services, among others. And what I'm showing to you on the screen is research-based done by Bromet and the colleagues. So I got these statistics, which I cannot validate about the total population of Ukraine. And what we currently have is just in line with the global WHO reports. Men are more at risk as compared to women. And young people between the age of 15 to 29 are also at eminent risk. Now, please, when you need to, with us, this is what is known. We need to know that these dynamics can change depending on the context. Yes, this may be the context of the entire country, the picture of the entire country, but the country is not homogeneous. There are villages, there are districts, there are towns. So the dynamics in those contexts must be observed when you are working on suicide prevention. We can move to understanding suicides, a multi-perspective approach, science, myths, and facts. So, as I mentioned, suicide is not explained as a one-way traffic. It has different perspectives. And I think as a good practitioner, you want to understand these perspectives very well. Understanding them will help us design the right interventions, including integrating suicide prevention in the work we are doing across board. So we have no absolute moral stance on suicide. We don't know if it's right or wrong. So that's why we use words like don't be judgmental, because we don't have any defined moral stance on suicides. It depends on one's culture, societal constructs, and the personal context. That is very important because suicide in every person is very unique. Drivers are very special, and it must be addressed in a way that reflects the person's lived realities and experiences. Among the displaced people, suicide is so much linked to loss, grief, bereavement, but also struggles and entrapments. We also have what's called suicide laws. I mean, many people from Ukraine have moved to new towns where the laws are different from where they came from. Laws can be not only formal laws or non-legislated laws. They can also be undocumented laws. For example, how do communities in town X behave towards people who have mental health difficulties? These are undocumented. So not all laws are on paper and are reinforced by law enforcement agencies. Culturally, we have what's called honor and duty. So we don't know, none of us knows everyone and every culture in Ukraine, even when it is one country. So in some cultures, suicide is seen as an act of honor or duty. I mean, for example, self-sacrifice in crisis situations. Many years ago, I was working in South Sudan, and soldiers there, and also in Sudan, also in Middle East, a little bit. So when a soldier fails from a community to meet their goal as soldiers, they'll take their own lives. And taking their own lives was far much better than living with shame. This is not different from what happened from the Japanese culture. I don't know if you heard about what's called the seppuku behaviors, where one person cuts off their head or cuts their stomach. That's far better than losing a battle. So we have what's called religious interpretations. This mostly, I understand Ukraine is an Orthodox, mostly Orthodox Christians. So I don't know how the context is in that, just to be clear. But many religious groups look at suicide as a crime. Sorry, I had gone. Kindly go back to the other slide. Let's go back to the previous slide. I haven't reached. Yeah, there. Yeah, so the seppuku culture, which is mostly common among Japanese, is one of those that actually recognizes and approves suicides as a way of behaving. So, following you failing to meet your military obligations. Please move forward. Next slide. Just a second. I think I've lost you. Yeah. So these are all culturally sanctions, actions or behaviors. So we need to be very aware of those dynamics. We have what's called death with dignity. Now, this is legalized suicidal behaviors or suicide acts where a person who is in pain is assisted to take their own lives. I don't think this is happening in most of the developed countries, but in greater Western Europe, it's a common practice. I don't know if it's happening also in Ukraine. Of course, we have death as martyrdoms. It's mostly common among extreme groups where one person really, and it can be a person and a community. We talked about suicide being not only individual, but can also be group-based. So here, individuals and communities get together and take their own lives. I don't want to go into this because of dynamics around it, but we've heard about the jihad groups, which actually sacrifice themselves with the goal of protecting religion and jihadi. This is African traditions. In Africa, we have I don't want to go into that so much, but we have so many also culturally sanctioned suicide behaviors, which actually normalizes suicidal death. So morally, suicide is seen as an absolute wrong. And one of the reasons why it is like that is because of people's philosophical and religious beliefs. So the danger with this is to prevent those ones who are in pain from seeking support. If you can look at the psychological perspective on my next slides, this is very important for us currently as an explanation to the increase in the suicidal thoughts among the Ukrainian population. Because of war, we've seen that war carries a lot of psychological trauma and is linked to PTSD, depression, guilt, and chronic stress. Now, these factors are extremely common among persons living with suicidal thoughts. We've also seen that there's been discontinuity and disruption of services, access to services, and those disruptions among people who have mental health difficulties before could be clear explanations why we have an increase in suicide. So some of the perspectives we embrace when understanding suicidal behaviors, understanding what psychological dynamics exist in the population. Now, legal perspectives, which means criminalization versus decriminalization. We know in many countries I've worked on this subject, suicide is illegal. If you talk about having suicidal behaviors as a symptom, even if communities observe that you have suicidal ideations and you are talking about taking your own life, they won't consider you as a person who's in need of support. If a doctor diagnoses you and finds out that you have suicidal ideations, they'll call the police. And in fact, for example, in my country, Uganda, you are supposed to be in prison for 7 years because you have attempted murder. And now this kind of behaviors and perspectives really can be problematic. That's why we've been talking about decriminalization of suicide as a starting point to increasing access of mental health services. And of course, you know, war and displacement kind of leads to fragmentation of society, which is now common in Eastern Europe and also in Africa and everywhere where there's war and conflict. And this fragmentation sociologically leads to loss of social fabric, which is a very important factor in reducing suicidal thoughts. That's why even in management, we encourage practitioners to find a way of linking people who are living with suicidal behaviors to actually reintegrate and seek psychosocial support from their community and family. So one of the contemporary scholars on suicide, Durkheim, say that where we have lack of social ties and fabric, we're likely to see an increase in suicidal behaviors. And we need to be able to actually fix societies and communities so that they're able to find a sense of belonging and seek support from within the community. Now, I rather spend all of my time and life explaining to you the next slide, which is the integrated motivation evolutional model. This is very important for both public health practitioners and non-professionals. So you rather forget about everything I've talked about from the start and only learn this model. It's the model is the solution to suicides in terms of practice. If you understand this, you've understood suicide entirely, in my opinion. Not because I'm so much in love with this, but because I've seen it working. I've seen it really improving uptake of services, improving quality of care. But also I've seen it improving early tracking of suicidal risk behaviors and improving response. Why is the IMV? It's called sometimes the IMV model, and I'm going to explain why it is important. Oh, not yet there. Yeah, there. Keep there. Mm-hmm. So many years ago, 2011, there's a researcher called Rory O'Connor. He was studying suicides and realized that suicide is not just an abrupt thing. It's a process. It's a long process. And in his work, he identified the process as three-tiered. We have what we call the pre-motivation phase, the motivational phase, and the evolutional phase. Now, every individual who comes to your health facility, who you meet and presents with suicidal behaviors, they are not suicidal now just like that. There are so many background factors that have shaped how they think about life and the future. Now, it is important that in the current crisis Ukraine is going through, you reflect back on the suicidal thoughts statistics I showed you earlier on my screen with the two bars. That should explain to you why there's an increase in terms of ideas versus an increase in attempts. Now, according to this model, the pre-motivational model, the pre-motivational phase means that every person you meet, they have vulnerabilities, which are both diathesis, which are biological, they have specific personalities, they have specific economic vulnerabilities, they have been exposed to war and many other life-threatening events. These factors are very important. When you're working with patients, you need to ask this question. You need to be intuitive to understand what background factors the person comes along with to you as a helper. If someone has this diathesis factors, biological difficulties, which you all carry, all of us who are here have these biological issues and challenges that we've carried, personality difficulties and differences. I can tell you that personalities are also important in understanding suicide. So people with different personality, especially borderline personality disorders, OCDs, can be at eminent risk. So these are all what O'Connor and the IMV model describes as background factors. And when you are assessing an individual, you want to understand some of these background factors. Two is the background factors work hand in hand with one's environment, what's called environmental influences. Which context is the patient or the individual you're working with living in? What is their home environment? Are they all alone? Are they living in displaced settings? how about the community they are coming from? If there are people with multiple intersecting gender and sexual identities, are they criminalized? Are they accepted? So all these, how are the religious sects and groups thinking about and treating them? Are they secluded? So these background factors must be documented every time you're working with communities and individuals. Even if it's not suicide targeted, you need to ask these questions because they are the starting point of suicide ideations. Now, as we understand this, we have what's called demotivational phase. So majority of the people who are ideating have got most of these background factors. At the motivational phase, the individual now start to reflect so much. Oh, I'm going through trauma. Oh, I've lost my properties. I'm grieving. I'm not liked. I'm not loved. I've lost everyone, respect in the community. I've lost my honor. I'm back home with nothing. Those ideas, those experiences shape the individual and push the individual to what we call demotivation phase. The motivational phase, according to IMV model, which I really want you to apply, I would think you want to adapt this in your work, means the person is now motivated. Because remember, if you have all these background factors, you start to think, life has no meaning. I've lost everything. I need to really take my own life. Now, the motivational phase is where one makes a correlation between their background factors with their current state of life. And that's when you start to shape what you call active suicidal thoughts. They are motivated now to still think about their own lives. And what we see in the motivational phase is people start to think they are trapped. I was once rich. I was once this. Now I was once a military officer. I was once a doctor. I was once a professor. Now I'm nothing. I feel trapped in this new status. When people from Ukraine move to other contexts, people refer to them as refugees, but these were prosperous people before. They are giving them a new identity. Imagine you were a military officer, you were a doctor, you were a professor, you were a teacher, you were a family man, and now people don't call you any of those things, but call you a refugee. So that already makes you feel trapped in that identity and that specific situation. And before we know, you start to lose hope. The war is not ending. Nothing's getting back to normal. That's when people start to think there's no life after. I'd rather be dead than living. And if nothing is done, people move to what we call the evolutionary phase. Unfortunately, when someone moves into the evolutionary phase, we can't do anything. They are already determined to take their own life. Sometimes we don't even get to know. They will definitely either use other existing lethal means to take their own lives. This is where action takes place. A person either hangs themselves with a rope, in my context, or gets a gun and blows their brains, or jumps off the building, or jumps in a train. I see this in Belgium. People always jump on train tracks, so they just jump in. So it's the evolutionary phase, the death phase. We can't save a dead person, the evolution. So our work must be at understanding the pre-motivational phase, where we start to address the background vulnerabilities and risk factors, the environmental factors. And when people move to the motivational phase, we implement crisis response interventions to prevent people from moving to the evolutionary phase. And there's so much we can do. For example, when we talk about the pre-motivational phase, we address issues like trauma. We integrate mental health and public health interventions, in community engagement interventions, in social welfare interventions. We integrate it in all that so that we are able to address and eliminate some of the vulnerabilities that people live with. In the motivational phase, we make sure that there's a lot of interventions designed to address senses of entrapment and to address suicidal ideations, including access to psychotropic medication, to address severe depression, support to those ones who are living with spectrum disorders, which have a direct linkage with suicidal behaviors. And in terms of evolutionary phase, what we can do with evolutionary phase is to actually decrease access to lethal means to suicide. So, for example, if you're working in detention centers or you're working with veteran communities, or if you need to make sure that there's no access to guns for those ones who are at risk, you have to say that the rooms, the communities where they're staying, the shelters are safe and have no access easy access to means to evolutions, to suicidal deaths, or to means of acting upon suicidal ideations. Okay, so my next slide is about what we call the common misconceptions that are held by so many people. Just to demystify these, we're going to learn about the myths. Some people believe that talking about suicide may push people to actually act upon them. That's a misconception. You want to be very direct, but very respectful. Ask individuals to talk about if they are feeling like taking their own lives. A person who talks about attempting suicide may rarely attempt suicide. So we talked about this. Verbally, people talk about it, and we must respect that. When no one talks about taking their own life in a crisis situation and they're not meaning it. So it's a myth. And in fact, this information must also go back to the communities. We've seen so many people who report to the treatment center where I do my work as well. And they say, oh, by the way, he talked about taking his life, but we thought he was joking. So people who talk about taking their lives are not joking. There's really nothing we can do. We can do a lot. We can help people. We can address the background factors. There's always something we can do. Suicide always occurs without any warning signs. That's not true. Suicide, most 90, if not 80% of these enactments happen with warning signs. We talked about warning signs. We just don't want to pay attention to them. It will mostly when people who have severe depression die of suicide. Some of them actually have seen a health worker before. Some of them have seen a general practitioner. So we need to learn how to ask these questions and pay attention to people's well-being. More misconceptions. People think that suicide doesn't happen in crisis situation where there is war. I've seen this so much in humanitarian response. People think that when war is happening, people are looking for survival. Most people may not necessarily look for survival because we've seen so many perspectives, so many factors, so many different drivers that are unique and peculiar to specific populations and contexts. So people in humanitarian settings can equally be at risk and may take their own lives. So suicide is a personal choice or a moral failing. People, especially people who are so much Christians, Islamic groups, and other faith-based institutions, they still hold the view that suicide is a personal choice, or someone has failed to live up to the moral standards of the church. This is not true. People have not failed to live up to the moral standards. People are going through psychological pain, and there are many other background factors that communities need to know about. Engaging community leaders, religious leaders, and legal advocates of the law, military groups, and law enforcement agencies will be very interesting to help them understand that this is not a moral failure. It's a crisis that a person is going through. It's also not true that only people with mental illnesses die by suicide. Suicide is not only about being mentally ill. There are people who choose to take their own lives because they are rationalizing it and feel they are better off dead than living. For example, I was in a country where a mother hanged herself, but she didn't die actually. And when we rescued her through the crisis response teams, she told us, I knew that if I died, NGOs would take care of my children. It's not that she was mentally ill. She had a rationale towards her decisions. And this is so common. So it's important that we understand all this. If you go to more facts, suicides occur in crisis settings and even may increase, as we've seen already. We've seen that so much suicidal ideations. Open conversations can reduce suicide risk. So we need to have this awareness, psych-education in community levels, and integrate also this kind of education in the public health education at facility level. Because we know that public health education is part of your care arrangements. So people must be educated about their conditions, about their well-being. Once in a while, we have sessions at health centers where we talk about this. Suicide is linked to multiple complex factors. We've seen the IMV model. So we must be able to recognize how each of these factors play a role and which one is more pronounced in the person's well-being and may pose a threat to the person and their own mental health. Of course, even when we know that it's not only people with mental illnesses at risk, but they are at risk as well, because we've seen depression and other conditions being key players in suicidal behaviors. Indeed, all suicide attempts are serious and need help. Again, so people always think that suicide prevention and response only requires us to work at the facility level, health facility level. This is not true necessarily. We also must recognize the social systems, engagement of gatekeepers of the communities if we are to prevent suicidal behaviors, but also increase uptake of mental health services. The next slide is about suicide prevention and case management. I think this is important for people who are involved in provision of case management services, both within academia or schools, health centers, community paraprofessionals, among others. How can you really prevent suicide extensively, and how can you engage yourself in meaningful case management that can prevent and respond to suicides among your target participants in your programs? Well, so what I want us to stick to the IMV model and how we can work with what we call the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scales. And why this tool for me, I feel, and my practice and experience, it's one tool that looks at the pre-motivation phase, the motivation phase, and the evolution phase. So what can we do at these layers? In my opinion and experience and practice, this tool helps us to know how to rank people and know what level of risk are they at the moment, and what can we do, rather than just engaging people as a homogeneous group and passively, and then before we know, the same people we've seen in our work ending up taking their own lives. So if you can click to the next slide, I want to say that when you, as a case manager, as a health worker, as a doctor, as a social worker, as a paraprofessional, before you even start engaging in case management around suicides, it starts with you actually appreciating which phase of suicide risk is the person. For example, if a person comes to the health facility for, let's say they've come for checkup, they have severe headaches. So the first phase is to understand what symptoms do they have beyond the headache. So you've assessed them and you found them having suicide ideation. So we need to understand what phase of risk are they at. We have what called the low risk, high risk. We have low risk, moderate, and high risk. So low risk may mean you're going to work with the basic care arrangements. Moderate, you increase the engagement and support. High risk, that is a psychiatric emergency and must be treated as such. So refugees and conflict affected populations, as I mentioned, extreme risks, distress, trauma, hopelessness. So suicide risks actually are as a result of some of those experiences. And if you can move to where I have the next slide, which has the 5 boxes, let us understand risk through the motivation, through the IMV model. So now, according to this model, the background factors that shape risks to suicides among conflict-affected populations, regardless of the context, are what we've talked about: trauma exposure, loss, change in social status, which is very important because if I was a military officer, police officer, professor, businessman, a child who was going through education, university, when all these things change, these turn out to be my background factors. And those changes now will interact with my death factors, background biological factors. And that interaction shapes my next move to the motivational phase. So, which means that first pre-motivational phase is the low risk phase, but is likely to move to the motivational phase, which is the second moderate phase, if there's nothing being done at the first stage. I would suggest you move to the next slide. So risk factors at pre-motivational phase, according to the IMV model, includes the person's genetic and personality traits. So you want to ask those. Early life and adversity exposure. If it's early life, age, you ask what did the person go through earlier? Have they been exposed? Have they experienced any loss? What biological factors, what's called the death factors, what are the environmental stressors around them? It could be poverty, it could be economic poverty, it could be marriage breakdowns, gender-based violence, all those things. Then at the motivational phase, you look at risk factors such as feelings of defeat and humiliation. This is very common: entrapment, lack of social support, hopelessness, and the perceived sense of burdensomeness. So when I worked with older persons who were really dying of suicidal behaviors, who were enacting suicides in the Sudanese refugee crisis, one of the things they used to give me, those ones who would find, and when they are really maybe have attempted or they've been rescued, they were telling me they were tired of being a burden to their young children or to their family members. So the motivational phase presents with unique drivers based on age, gender, culture, and diversity. And then evolutionary phase, we look at if there is access to means, the risk is high. If people, depending on the age, if there is age, gender, and the context. So if there's access to guns among veterans, they will definitely consider suicides. If there's easy exposure to destructive behaviors, such as engaging in substance use, unregistered substance use and abuse, among others, they will definitely, the risk will also increase at community level. So it's important that despite us being experts as health workers, as paraprofessionals, we understand some of the multicultural assessment tips you need to pay attention to. So we have what called cultural sensitivity. As I mentioned, you may all be from Ukraine, but culture is not static. War can change culture and diversities and who people are and religious beliefs. I was working on a document recently on faith-sensitive mental health across the world with Queen Margaret's University, and I found that war and displacement and conflict change how people believe, both in their traditional churches and faith systems, to even not believing at all. And their culture changes as well. So you need to ask what cultural sensitivities now people hold. It may take, you may, if you underestimate this, you may end up missing out some important information. Assessment and diagnosis involve, you must consider the lived realities of people before you start diagnosing them and asking more information, because these form what you call the background factors. Because also experiences of people influence behaviors, including how they present and report symptoms at different phases we've talked about. And I think it's important to ask about what people believe in. Because remember, hopelessness is also linked to believing in something, faith in something. So you need to ask about those, you need to ask about socioeconomic and cultural practices of people, and if they have any existing social support networks and systems. So, so therefore, in conclusion around this, it's important that we understand that the IMV model, which I talked about, talks about the pre-motivation phase. Here, we talk about the background factors. Motivation, we talk about the entrapment and suicide ideations. Evolution, talking about the transition from ideations to suicidal actions. So the steps to you using the steps you need to have as a practitioner, you need to look at, you need to identify background factors. So when you're assessing someone, pay attention to identifying, you need to move forward with the slides. Move forward. I think we are still on the, yeah, again, move. Oh, I think you went far. Sorry, there. Thank you. Yeah, so it's important that as a practitioner, you take a step-by-step process. You identify background vulnerabilities and stresses a person presents with beyond, if they are presenting with a specific medically diagnosable disease, also take time to understand what other background vulnerabilities that can compound their current condition they are living with. If it's an unaccompanied child, that could be a risk, but also ask more other vulnerabilities and stresses that may really compound the child's mental health. Assess feelings of entrapment and hopelessness. Determine if the person has crossed from motivation to volition. If they've crossed from motivation to volition, now find a way of doing what you call safety. Make sure that the person is safe. They are away from all means that really things which can make it easier for them to take their own life. Next slide, which is about using the Columbia Suicide Severity Scale. As I mentioned, this is very important. It's a very basic tool that can help all of us, regardless of whether you're a medical worker or you're a non-specialist, even teachers. So the tool was designed to assess suicidal ideations and behaviors. So you use this to assess if a person is ideating or they've already crossed to motivation and acting upon the thoughts. So what we do here, we have questions that help us to know if the person is passively thinking about taking their own life or they're actively think about taking their own lives. And please, you can move to the IMV model. Yeah, thank you. So the CSSR, which is really a nice tool you can access online for free. One talks about the ideations. Here I'll talk about people asking or saying they wish they were dead. So the person is wishing they were dead. And the tool itself gives you a chance to know if they are having active or passive suicidal thoughts. Now, if they present with you with suicidal ideations, they don't have any plan because they are already they don't have the intent. They are just still at the passive state. So the tool is very nice that it gives a chance to actually rate that. Is the person at the passive state or they're now at the active state? At the actual, what you call the behavior level, where people now move to attempting suicides, they actually, the tool provides you with chance to ask those questions and assess that you can rate the person and design interventions that can help you deal with these behaviors appropriately. So it's important that when you're working with the CSSR tool, the Columbia Suicide Rating Scale, you're able to link it to the IMV principles, which is the pre-motivation, motivation, and evolution phases. Now, when you link the two, when you're doing your notes as a medical worker, as a paraprofessional, as a non-professional, non-expert, non-specialist, the tool will help you get the symptoms. Now check the 3 layers we talked about of the IMV model, and now know where is the person. If the person is at the pre-motivational phase, you start to design already interventions there that will prevent them from moving to moving the pre-motivation to the motivational phase. If the tool demonstrates that the person or reports that the person is already at the motivational phase, you should be able to design crisis interventions there and then that will help you to deal with that stage. And indeed, what we normally do after that is to focus on crisis interventions and PSS support. In summary, these are the actionable steps you can take. Early identification can happen at the pre-motivational phase, which means that all of us we should probably address ourselves to the right information, including knowing the telltale signs I've just mentioned, the perspectives, and all those things we've just talked about today. It's only not enough to you to know as who is here. It's also important that the primary caregivers of those ones who are at eminent risk, especially the older veterans, the children at risk, people with disabilities, and people who are secluded because of their gender, sexuality, and race. So you need to make sure that you really identify those earlier. So the identification means you start to build the systems of care to safeguard them and their well-being. At the assessment stage, you categorize people depending on the risk levels, who is where and where, because categorization means you're going to be able to actually design and respond appropriately. Then at the end of the day, which is level 3, is you apply the IMV model interventions, supporting people depending on the phase they are in. At immediate response, we do what you call case management through crisis interventions and supervision. Then long-term intervention means we need to increase uptake to mental health referrals and coping strategies. But understanding this long-term planning for suicide prevention means you must understand what background factors are more common within a specific at-risk group for suicide behaviors. Okay, this is very interesting. We are now moving away from you, the practitioners, to now mapping and working with the communities who are at risk. We've seen now how to identify who is at risk. We've seen the veteran, the people who changed statuses. We've seen the children with disabilities, the people with disabilities. We've seen older persons. You map out depending on your area of work and who you work with. One of the things that to introduce is what's called the safety planning for suicide prevention. So safety planning has been very helpful in my work in refugee settlements, but also on the front line, like the Sudanese crisis where I've been in the last couple of weeks, but also in the Sudanese crisis, South Sudanese crisis, which is going on right now, and the DRC response. So we've seen that when we train people who we've mapped out to already be at eminent risk, Not everyone in crisis is at risk of suicide behaviors, not everyone. But depending on the background factors and the risk factors we've seen, they can be at risk. So what if you are going to work at the community level, you want to map out what are the risk factors and who is mostly affected. And if you're working at an institutionalized level, like a health center or a hospital or a medical center, you want to see if it's one client, you want to sit with this client who's still at the passive suicide level or the ideation level, and then do what you call safety planning with the person. So I want to read your story in short, if with your permission, so that you understand what I mean when I say safety planning. I have a friend of mine called Sarah. Sarah is from Zone X in Uganda. She's 24 years old, university student, had been silently struggling with depression and overwhelming feelings of hopelessness. After a painful breakup and failing 2 major exams, she began to think that her life had no value. We've seen that symptom already. One night, she confided in her roommate, who encouraged her to speak to the university counselor. During her first session, the counselor gently asked her if she was having suicidal thoughts. You see what we mentioned? We must not avoid asking about suicidal thoughts. We must ask directly these questions. They are very important. The counselor introduced Sarah to what we call a safety plan, explaining that it was a helpful tool to help her stay safe. When suicidal thoughts became intense, together, not only the counselor or the health worker or the paraprofessional, it's a joint way of working together. They created the plan step by step. So if you can really move to my next slide. So what we call suicide safety planning is a collaboratively developed structured plan between the individual at risk of suicide and the support person. Doesn't have to be a medical worker, a psychiatrist, a clinical psychologist. It can as well be a social worker. It can as well be a trained community member or a gatekeeper. So if everyone was trained at community level about safety planning, it can decrease. People will be aware, because sometimes suicidal thoughts come when people don't want to risk. I want to tell you that rarely people want to die from suicide, but they're just overwhelmed with this intense desire for death and escape. So you want to always make them aware that they can seek support, they can keep safe, they can seek support from somewhere, collaboratively. The objective of actually the safety planning orientation for your clients should be, one, to understand components of the plan. They should be able to learn how to develop and implement their own safety plans. They themselves, as people who are at risk, should be able to identify warning signs and how to cope with those warning signs. How can they connect with support systems, and how can we as support systems, health workers and etc., reduce access to legal means? Your safety plan template looks like this on my screen, if you can share it. You need to move to the next slide, which has a safety plan tool. Yeah, so a safety plan tool, looks like this. You ask a person, the first step is to sit down with the patient or the person at risk, and you ask them, you discuss what thoughts, images, mood, situations, behaviors that you may be developing currently. They'll tell you, oh, I've been thinking about taking my own life, la, la, la. So you document those things with them, not from your perspective, but from the perspective of the person in front of you. And then you want to ask which things can you do? So you keep pushing the discussion to them, because it's a collaboration. You're a facilitator. So in the safety planning, you are facilitating the person to become more aware of suicidal thoughts and how they can help themselves in case they find themselves with intense desire and pain. And then people and social settings that provide distraction. So sometimes people can tell you, oh, I can watch TV, I can do ABC and D. So you look at those systems that can help them. And then where can they seek support? Who can they talk to? And then after that, please leave your contacts with them so they can call you in case they feel they are in a crisis. And support me with the next slide, please. Thank you. So it's the goal of safety planning is to help the person recognize their warning signs, use appropriate coping strategies, be empowered to seek support, and contact professional resources, including using a crisis toll-free line, which is a free number where people can call and seek support. Reduce access to lethal means and implement what you call a follow-up plan, which is led by you now, collaboratively with the person at risk. So some of the things you can think about is music, reading, engaging in social activities, relaxation and breathing exercises, cognitive reframing, positive affirmations, list personal coping strategies, etc. Encourage people to identify trusted people they want to speak to, encourage them to have open discussions about their struggles, because some of some people really feel ashamed of their mental health struggles. So encourage them to really have conversations. In fact, you can go an extra mile to be very practical and have them engage in role plays. I love using this so that people feel they are not just engaging in a passive discussion. So yeah, so we have support systems like, of course, suicide prevention helplines, which I think you have in Ukraine now, therapists and crisis work lines, etc. And in terms of restricting access to lethal means, you need to work with duty bearers, medical workers, regulatory authorities, pass bylaws if possible. Let the hospital be clear with the settings where people can be isolated for their own safety, as well as setting the right environment where a person can feel safe than hurting themselves. Lastly is how can communities play a role in suicide prevention? So it's important that as people who are here, we identify curriculums. So if you check online, we developed in the UNHCR guidelines on suicide prevention and response, we developed what we call a gatekeepers approach training content. So you can pick, there are lots of materials in there that you can really adapt and train gatekeepers. Gatekeepers, we mean leaders and opinion leaders, people who play specific roles in specific communities. When I say communities, I don't mean the entire district or city. It can be a community of veterans because we've seen that they can be at risk. It can be a community of children who are unaccompanied. You can see it can be a community of specific people with disabilities, among others, older persons, etc. So a community, you find who are the key outstanding gatekeepers of that community. It also can be police, because police can be criminalizing, legislating, enforcing law. So you can train them on how to really safeguard and promote awareness on suicides and mental health in the communities. You can find, for example, the suicide first aid guidelines, which we can train gatekeepers on so that they are able to support and provide support. We can also improve what we call community-based psychosocial support informed efforts, which means we go and interact with the church, the faith-based actors, because they talk to people every Sunday. They are on TVs, they are on social media. You can identify who are the bloggers we have, who are the bloggers, social medias. Like you need to find a community that can really advance information access and where people can seek support from. Meaningful engagement and building on local capacities and knowledge. People understand suicides and mental health in their community. So please get out of the health facility, engage them in proactive communication and discussions so that you design together meaningful and practical ways of preventing suicides in the deeper community levels. And so, of course, if you move forward with my slides, there are different levels of engagement. We have what called the universal, primary, secondary, and post-intervention engagements. Universal engagement in suicide prevention, we mean they're working on all actions that can really engage and prevent suicides. Post-interventions means we support those ones who have gone through suicide behaviors before and their families. At individual level, we've talked about how to assess. Relationship level, must build relationships with people. Community and society levels have different levels of response. This is don't worry, this is almost my last slide so that we can have questions and answers. What are the most effective ways to reduce stigma around suicides in the communities affected by war? I think we need to first understand. We need to first understand what stigma means. For so long, stigma has been misused as a concept in the humanitarian world. But again, you need to understand that stigma comes from a deeper understanding that whatever you say, the laws you believe in, the legislation you have, your ethos of practice, can your traditional faith, religious, cultural beliefs, and a sense of awareness can impact how a person feels about seeking support. So stigma is a mark of disgrace where a person, because they are struggling with a mental health difficulty, they feel they don't have to engage because people are going to anyway know about them. It's a stain, it's a reproach on one's reputation. So you start to label, oh, that person is a weakling in the community because he's even thinking about taking his own life, or he survived the suicide. So we must be able to understand that stigma is more personal, it's so depending, it's just depending pain, and it can be a cause of suicide itself. So stigma, interestingly, can be a cause of suicide, and it can be an outcome of suicide. So a person who lives with suicidal behaviors or ideations can actually be subject to stigma. But when there's also an increase in stigma because of gender, age, diversity, life status, conflict and violence, among others, that stigma that comes with a lot of that can be a driver of suicidal behaviors. In fact, suicide-related stigma can be both public and self. Public means you, a community that you're working with, holding negative views about suicides and mental health seeking behaviors. Self-stigma meaning the individual, because he's living with a suicide risk factor. It could be depression, it could be loss and grief. They start to feel they don't have to live in this community because they have failed in life. Now, that self-stigma can drive suicidal thoughts at individual level. And it can be more compounded if the entire community where we're working from holds public stigma around the specific mental health experience. My next slide is, if you can move, is how can we encourage help-seeking behaviors in populations that may view mental health struggles as a weakness. Now, we know that mental health, such as depression, which is linked to suicide, and anxiety are prevalent and are common everywhere. So we need to make people aware that mental health is not, all of us are susceptible. All of us can be at risk. It's just a matter of time. We need to make people aware of what you call the background factors that can drive anyone or make everyone susceptible to mental health difficulties. We've seen, according to IMV model, that background factors includes biological and genetic factors. Some of us may be carriers of some of the specific mental health conditions. We may be carriers of genes that related to depression and schizospectrum disorders. So, and even susceptibility to coping. So like we may not be having the ability to cope with just social stressors simply because of how biologically we are designed. So we need to make sure that people are aware of these facts. So psychoeducation on TVs and through contact persons should be at the front line. So the more we open the dialogue around prevalences, susceptibility, risk factors, is the more increase and but also establish confidence in people to start looking at experiences of mental health as normal and seeking for support as a normal way to deal with that experience. We need to understand that that there are so many things which shape these experiences of mental health. Please move to the next slide, which is implement a social and behavioral change strategy. In every community you are in, it's important that if you are targeting to increase uptake of mental health interventions, you should know that low uptake comes with attitude, stigma, and behaviors. So how people think about mental health determines if they are going to seek for support. So you need to contextualize in your work a social behavior change strategy. If it's at a medical center level, hospital level, there must be something like that integrated into your practice. If it's at community level or group level, there must be that component in your work plan. How do you change attitudes and behaviors around the mental health? And your goal actually should be to reduce stigma as a starting point, because stigma deters people from coming for support. Secondly, is when you reduce stigma, you improve access to help-seeking behaviors, and then you foster supportive environments. Now, your strategy should involve the following key components. One is awareness and education. You need to deliver a culturally sensitive messaging through radios, posters, and other IEC materials translated in locally people in languages that people are comfortable with. Capacity building, which we talked about, training community leaders, youth, and other frontline workers on provision of psychological first aid and suicide prevention. So we need to train the gatekeepers of those groups. Community engagement, we need to use participatory methods because we talk about behavior change and attitudes. So I love using theater and puppetry because I don't want to talk a lot when we talk about suicides. So I use mostly participatory mechanisms, theater, drama, plays, skits. I know this may be applying to my African realities, but you can find a way and meaningful ways of engaging with the Ukrainian population. Encourage empathy and compassion. So this is easier to communicate these. And I know I've met really so many good orators and poets from Ukraine. So that's one way we communicate about mental health. So we communicate it through participatory means. Safe messaging, promote non-stigmatizing language and media reporting. And you probably want to look at the WHO guidelines on that. Access to care. We need to get away from the health facilities and medical centers and take clinics to the deeper communities where there's no access through mobile clinics so that people know that they can really reach out to you and then seek for support. In conclusion, suicide prevention in institutionalized care centers requires structured risk assessment. That's the first starting point, combined with IMV model with CSSR, which improves accuracy so that we know we are not just assessing or planning for a person who is already in the motivational phase, yet we are really developing or working with him as if he or she was at the pre-motivational phase. Training and resource allocation and mental health support are key to the community and at-risk groups. Ongoing evaluation of suicide prevention strategies is essential. So suicide in refugee settings is a multifaceted issue requiring understanding of the diverse perspectives I used before the start of the training, the orientation here, the webinar. You must combine it with both the cultural, moral, psychological, social, and legal insights so that your way of working is purely informed by real perspectives than assumed perspectives. Well, as I mentioned, that suicide is a complex issue. It requires collaboration, not only from health workers, it must be a collaborative effort and requires multi-sectorial efforts, which means you must work with all the key players, police, doctors, psychiatrists, psychosocial workers, teachers, and community gatekeepers, as well as other key players who are involved in this work. Thank you so much. I don't know if you have any questions. I'm happy to respond. Thank you. Back to you. Back to you, Safi.
Можна питання?
I have a question.
Так, доброго дня, дякую за презентацію.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Can you please share what would be your advice if a 14-year-old child refuses to share information with their relatives about their suicidal ideation? So what should we do not to break compliance of this communication. So we have established the contact with the child, but they don't want anyone except from me to take part in making the plan. And the child asks me not to tell anyone, especially their parents and their mother.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. It's very common among adolescents. And so two things should happen. One is we need to understand that children, despite their age, they have rights and they are so much aware. What you're describing also reports the lack of trust between the child and their primary caregivers. One thing that you should be aware of, again, we're going back to the background factors, right? So we need to understand, I don't want to be judgmental here, but could it be that part of the reasons the child is not communicating to you or doesn't want the family members to know? One is they think they want to protect their families from not understanding what is driving their suicidal behaviors or thoughts. Two is, could it be that the family is playing a significant role in shaping the suicidal ideations? Now, it's important that you, first of all, explain. The child has assent, true, but you don't want to break the relationship between the child and the family. You want to explain to the family members separately that the child is undergoing care, and they should be aware, in my opinion, about the child's ongoing struggles, because they are the primary caregivers, except if you are telling me that I don't know if you've assessed that, and you've assessed the background factors, the drivers of these thoughts around the child. If the parents are not the reason why the child is suicidal, I feel I know and I'm convinced that they have a right to know, because there's a step where we have to break confidentiality in the interest of that child. Is a minor, is beyond the age of consent. So sometimes we have to go an extra mile and make sure the primary caregivers are aware of what the child is going through. If they are not aware and something happens, and then we've been aware as health workers, as practitioners, the responsibility kind of legally may shift back to you. So we must be able to break confidentiality where we feel we must break it in the interest of the child. Secondly, is we may never know what is compounding the ideations of the child until when sometimes we engage with the primary caregivers, except in circumstances where the child reports abuse, violation, and the family being the risk to her well-being, or him or her well-being. I don't know if that's helpful. Thank you.
Да, дякую. Дякую за підтвердження.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your answer.
I see a question on working with LGBTQ, recommendations about working with the teenagers from LGBT communities. This is a very, very, very important question. So in all contexts and with ongoing difficulties, the LGBT communities have done some work with them in Kakuma in Nairobi, remain an at-risk group. And as I mentioned, that one of the, the drivers of suicides among people with diverse sexual orientations are issues to do with social seclusion. So one of the things we've done is, of course, to implement what we call bullying prevention interventions in centers where they engage, so that people can understand that they may be people with different diverse views and orientations, but they still belong here. So implementing bullying prevention is key, but also implementing intervention that specifically targets them as a special population are very important. Yes, I see a hand.
Так, вітаю, чи мене чути?
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Окей. Хотіла запитати,
I have a
якщо
question.
у молодого
What if
хлопця були
There is a young guy who had a previous suicidal attempts twice. Right now, there are no suicidal attempts, but there is regular self-harm as a means to cope with difficult feelings. So they have not developed the skill of constructively processing the hard feelings. And here is my question. The suicidal attempts started once the boy graduated from school because of the fear of the future. The future is about responsibilities. I will not cope with this. I am not capable to overcome all of these difficulties. The hypothesis I have is that it's the influence of the father, who is very proactive, who is making some pressure on the child, wants them to achieve a lot, and the client is a different kind of person. So there was also a bunch of other factors like the divorce in the family, younger children who also had the impact and the structure of the boy's psyche. So what should I do in this case if the boy lives with the father, and I assume that the pressure comes from the father? So what should we do before the boy learns to constructively process the hard feelings?
Thank you very much. That's a very complex case, and I acknowledge the work you're doing already. So two things. As I mentioned, suicide ideations can last for as long as 30 years plus. A person can live with them, they can grow with them, and they may think about it in their lives for that long period of time. And one suicide attempt itself at one point in life is a predictor of future suicidal enactments. So a person who has attempted suicide before, they are likely to do it again in case they find themselves in the same emotionally draining circumstances. Among teenagers, emotional abuse and pressures and bullying, this continuously compound this experience as children keep growing. As we saw that the more people grow with unresolved psychological and emotional difficulties, is the more the risk continues. And why they may not have enacted or acted upon those thoughts at one point in life is sometimes because they haven't made up their mind. They are suicidal, but have gone back to the pre-motivation phase. They've gone back to the passive state. And one thing that why I'm saying passive state is because they start to re-engage in passive suicidal behaviors, not active. For example, what you call the non-fatal suicidal ideations or behaviors include self-harm. So self-harm is not an act of suicidal enactment. The person is going through pain, but don't want to take their own lives. They are struggling deeply with emotional pain that is coming from their own life experiences. So we need to understand that the person right now you're describing is in the passive state and they're going through emotional pain. And we must work with them in a way that addresses the emotional difficulties they are going through. And the problem with self-harm, they are not intending to die, but unfortunately, in the process of doing that, they may end up dying. So most of the patients I work with self-harm behaviors, they may cut one day, they cut one vein upon the other, and they may end up dying in the process. So they are at risk of dying, not because they intend to take their own lives, but because they are struggling with deeper emotional pain. So our intervention should, especially psychological pain, should involve us assessing their emotional well-being and design clinical psychological interventions that address the emotional difficulties they have. Because self-harm through body cutting is this suppressed anger and emotional pain that people don't know how to communicate out and process. So we must work in a way, one thing I do is educate the person, recognize other alternative ways of coping with these emotions, and then work with their other existing support systems. So I feel that would be the theory of change that can help this person. But please see that this person, first of all, as a person who is currently suicidal, back in the passive regress state, and failure for us to support them at this phase may mean they may one day accidentally die from suicide. So it's a person at risk.
Можна ще одне питання по цьому кейсу?
And one more question about the same case.
Якщо клієнт боїться дуже
If
майбутнього,
the client
тобто
is afraid of future,
так?
such
Чи
as
варто
university, for
допомагати
instance,
долати
should we encourage them to overcome this fear and become a university student, or should they stay at home for a year?
Okay, that's a good question. So there's something we call CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't think we need to help the person to stay at home because that would affect the child's future. Now, this child you're describing holds a fixed belief about the future. The future for him or her is blurry, but also scary, right? Now, what we do is you want to borrow some of the cognitive behavioral therapy techniques called cognitive reframing. So in that regard, you help the child to shift their perceived, to change their perceived fear for the future and emotional difficulty they may experience to something different, something more positive. And I think one of the things I want to share with you is you trying to get the child back to focus on what benefits will it be if they went to the university. So if you stop them from going there, it's going to affect them because they are children, right? They're going through pain already. So you reframe, you restructure their perspective about the future. And I think you can read more about the CBT techniques. Those are very helpful. Cognitive reframing can help you learn how to work with this child. Yeah, so I feel she has a fixed fear for the future because of other background factors, but your work is to reshape the perspective the person holds so that they are able to see the value of going to the university rather than not going. Yeah.
Дякую. Щиро вдячна за презентацію, за
Thank you
інформацію.
so much
і рада
for your
була
presentation and the information you shared. Thank you.
Thanks for the good question. Yeah, please go ahead. I see a hand raised. Please proceed.
Доброго дня, вітаю всіх колег. Дякую величезне за захід.
Hello everyone, dear colleagues. Thank you for this event and the in-depth lecture. I am Irina Yavorska. I work for humanitarian organizations. My first question has to do with the Colombian suicidal scale. I have not heard about their adaptation and validation in Ukrainian and Russian. And if this has not taken place yet, can we use the scale? Because you are relying quite heavily on it, but what if we just translate it into Ukrainian? Will it be effective in measuring these things? And my second question is about the systems in the communities. Do you have any successful cases of communities establishing these safe environments? If yes, how many volunteers did it take, and what specific fields did they work in? How did they encourage? Which information provide? What other specialists were engaged? Should we have a hotline 24/7? Should we have any centers available around the clock? Thank you.
Very brilliant questions. Thank you so much. I'll start with the first one on Colombia suicide CSSR. It's an approved tool with really very strong properties and can be applied in different contexts. Again, it's in good practice that the tool is adapted to the context, including culture and language. I'll double check if we have a translated version of this that can be adapted. I really encourage you to adapt it to the context, but again, I'm going to work with ARQ International and see if we can get you an adapted version to this, if one exists. I'm not aware of the adaptations that so far have been done. But again, I've applied this really in 2 regions so far, that is in Africa, but also in Middle East, and it has really worked wonders. I feel still with its strong strength and strong properties and more recognized by the American Psychosocial Association and many others. It's a good tool to work with. It can be adapted to any context. Literally, the properties it holds can be validated by many other tools. So I feel please go ahead with this. It's a good case management tool and can be adapted because of its strong properties. And then in terms of our community-based success stories and interventions and engagements, yes, we were at the apex of suicides in northern Uganda and in South Sudan and the DRC. One of the things we formed to really build a strong safety net at community level was to identify what we call paracounselor structures. Paracounselors, literally for me, come from both the semi-trained professionals, it had teachers, number of teachers working in the learning schools, in the schools, learning centers, and they were trained to really identify suicide risks and referral, and also provision of the psychological first aid. So that meant that paracounselor structure was targeting only school-going children who were at risk, because we knew that suicide were also a growing issue among refugee children. So we had one structure of paracounselors made up of at least 10 teachers in our primary and secondary schools. So 5 for each school. These were trained and supervised by one professional. Now, why supervision is important is because we know the subject is sensitive a little bit, but also requires us continuously empowering and supporting them. We didn't invest any money into it because for us it meant that we can't sustain those efforts without money. So we had to remove the tokenistic approach.
Який він симпатичний.
And then lastly,
Ой,
one of the
мені він
things,
подобається. Ну, такі.
so one of the things we also did was to make sure that we integrate what we call social emotional learning in suicide prevention. And why we did that was teachers had to learn about emotional regulation for children. So that was a school setting. At community level, we identified social workers, people with degrees in social work, religious leaders, because we know we've just seen also on my slides that there are always religious views around suicides, but also religions serve as a haven for emotional support, where most people go when they are really in stronger pain. So it can be a combination of people with specific levels of expertise and education, even I don't know if there are any other questions. Okay, it seems we don't have any other questions. Okay, so on the last point, the last question I answered was on the communities. Okay, please go ahead. I see your hand is raised. Proceed.
Я вирішила використати нагоду, раз немає питань.
Will use this opportunity since there are no other questions. What would be your advice for borderline personalities with a suicidal intent or attempts or self-harm?
Please say that again.
What would you advise for borderline personalities with suicidal attempts or suicidal intent and a suicidal ideation? What would be your advice for such kinds of clients?
Yeah, thank you.
How do-
Thank you again. Yeah, thank you again. That's a very good question. As I said, borderline personality is a risk, is a background factor. It's a risk factor, right? And not every person with a borderline personality disorder will really go ahead and hang themselves or enact or they'll be suicidal. But in case they happen to be suicidal, we follow again the same framework of care as we mentioned. One is we need to be very aware of when they are at the age because of their life experiences. So remember, personality may be enduring, but depending on the context the person finds themselves in, the environment, all of us with our specific personalities can be at risk, but the environment must facilitate that. So if a person with a borderline personality finds themselves in a very deeply challenging environment, you should be aware when they communicate that they are in pain. So being more present and aware is important, and then identifying the same warning signs which they may present, as we mentioned. But for me, it's important to understand that having a personality may be a risk, but doesn't necessarily mean that the person is going to be suicidal. So it's a risk, and that risk must interact with the environment or the circumstances the person finds themselves in. So if I was going to target 50 people in this room, if I find that 10% of the people we have in this room have borderline personality, and the room is full of challenges, I will know they won't be able to cope easily with the challenges in that room. So I will design my interventions in a way that safeguards them from being affected significantly by the changes in the room. So creating the safety plan with them will be the starting point, because in a room where there are 50 people, they are at risk. So safety plan should be the first thing you do with them. Two is psychoeducation about possible suicidal thoughts and how the environment may affect them because of who they are. So you need to just make them aware and then give them the support they need to be able to seek support in case they feel they're starting to think about taking their own life because they are trapped in that environment. Yeah. Thank you.
Дякую.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you have any other questions.
Напевно, питань вже немає, тому ми можемо поступово завершувати. Я всім дуже
It
дякую за
seems
участь.
there are no other
Бачу
questions,
купу
and
питань щодо
I'm grateful to
презентації.
everyone
Зараз
who
тощо
participated.
буде
Many
відскановано.
people
Зараз потрібно
requested the
сформувати.
slides
Також
and the video recording. Yes,
форму зворотнього
this will be
зв'язку. Тож
available.
сьогодні
Also, we will be requesting that you fill out the feedback form, and quite soon everyone is going to get an email with a link to the recording and the feedback form, and also communication options for you to get in touch with our team.
Я бачу підняті руки. Якщо хтось хоче задати питання, будь ласка.
I see the hands raised, so you can ask your question.
Якщо питань немає, можемо вже
And if you do not,
I think the meeting is ending, so maybe I will. Yeah. So my question was about tomorrow's technical working group, and I wanted to ask Moses if he has any recommendations from his work about how suicide as a topic can be better managed through coordination between different agencies and the government, etc. So if any top line recommendations that can help us tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks, Sameh. If you can hear me, that's a very interesting point. So I think two things should go along with you is suicide is not a one person's work, and it's the drivers, the factors that drive suicidal behaviors are so deeply rooted in the work of others. When it comes to those ones who are doing protection, because they are not necessarily doing lots of work they're supposed to be doing, or if there are gaps in the work they are doing, then suicide can come from that perspective. So it's important that you communicate suicide as a suicide response and prevention as a multi-sectorial effort that requires collaborative efforts. And in terms of government, we're talking about government calling upon government to government stakeholders to be deeply involved in pushing integration of suicides into the general public health interventions and framing. And I think it's also important that you double check legislation. I mean, if someone works with duty bearers at legislative level, you want to push developing of the national suicide strategy, which means this will apply to all the contexts in Ukraine, but also guide what should be the key things that the government should be at the top of, so that it's not only an NGO, INGO or humanitarian business, it becomes a national issue. So that means we need to push for that. And then secondly, if suicide is criminal in Ukraine, we should also speak about suicide decriminalization. I think those for me are the key outstanding things you want to speak about. Thank you. Back to you, Sahi.
Тоді будемо завершувати нашу зустріч. Ще раз всім дуже дякуємо.
So then we will finish here. Thank you so much, everyone. I wish you a productive day, and let's stay in touch. Please follow the messages in your mailbox.
До побачення.
Thank you and have a good day. Bye-bye.
До побачення, Мозес. Гарного дня.
Thank you. Have a good day, Moses.